What would you do if you were fined $35,000 just because a police officer said you were wrong? With no photos, no video, no evidence, only personal opinion? Would you pay and move on? Would you hire a lawyer? Or would you walk into the courtroom and make the entire system take a step back? The story you're about to witness isn't just about a typical lawsuit. It's a collision between assumed authority and buried truth. Between a judge who thought he could bypass every procedure and a woman who refused to let that happen. It all started on what seemed like a normal morning in Atlanta. An administrative hearing was scheduled in under 10 minutes. No media, no outside defense counsel. No one thought the hearing would last more than half an hour. And no one in that room, not even the judge, knew they were about to face someone unlike anyone who had ever stepped in before. Her name was Ariana Lowell, a civil attorney, hair neatly tied back, posture composed, nothing attention-grabbing. But within minutes, she turned what looked like a predetermined hearing into a full-blown legal earthquake. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't beg. She simply placed three things on the table: legal precedent, truth, and unshakable resolve. And then, the moment no one expected, she revealed that she was the very person who had written the law the court was using to fine her. From a silent defendant, she became the one who interrogated the entire system, forcing everyone in that room to confront the truth they had avoided for far too long. We also invited a federal legal expert to analyze the hearing, and he had only one thing to say: a verdict can be overturned, but someone brave enough to stand up like that sets a precedent for an entire generation. So what exactly happened inside that courtroom? And why did more than 12 cities across the United States temporarily suspend their entire administrative fine system after this hearing? Watch until the end, and you'll understand why this story isn't just about a wrongful penalty. It's about how justice truly operates or gets distorted. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next episode, where Ariana's true identity brings the entire courtroom to silence. Atlanta, Georgia. That morning there was no rain, but the air was strangely damp. Gray clouds drifted low above the government buildings, hovering as if reluctant to let go. The atmosphere felt thick like a curtain, cool but not cold, just enough to make someone shiver without knowing why. Courtroom 4C, Fulton County Courthouse, was usually home to brief, uneventful administrative hearings. Small matters, stamped and done. But that morning something felt off. Not because a celebrity's name was on the docket, not because there were cameras or reporters waiting at the gate, but because the air inside the courtroom felt like it had been set up in advance. Ariana Lowell arrived on time. No rush, no fear, just a slender figure in a simple charcoal gray blazer carrying a worn brown leather briefcase, the kind rarely seen in today's digital courtrooms. She didn't bring an assistant. No one walked with her. She didn't need anyone. And maybe that was the first thing that made everything veer off course. When she walked in, the court clerk didn't greet her. The stenographer lowered her head hurriedly, as if trying to avoid eye contact. A bailiff let out a quiet sigh and looked away. And up front, in the tallest chair in the room, Judge Derek Blackstone was already seated, a rare sight for a man notoriously late. He didn't look at her as a fellow attorney, or even as a citizen with a right to be heard. He looked at her like a nuisance to be swiftly removed. Ariana stepped forward and placed the briefcase on the table. The room was so silent, she could hear the faint zip of the briefcase opening. She hadn't even sat down when Judge Blackstone's deep, dry voice sliced through the air like a blade. Case number 40,982. Violation of Code 18A. Administrative fine, $35,000. Effective immediately. No opening remarks. No announcement that the court was in session. No invitation for counsel to present. Nothing. Just a single sentence. A ruling. As if the outcome had been decided before she even walked in. Ariana lifted her head. Her eyes met the judge's. Cold, hollow. No flicker of deliberation or doubt. Only the force of a man in a black robe, wielding power like a hammer with no need for reasoning. Behind her, no one moved. No one objected. Even the prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a wrinkled tie, raised an eyebrow, as if he too had misheard. Ariana didn't respond right away. She took a deep breath, not from nerves, but because the silence was so thick, so weighted, as if trying to press her into the familiar mold. Stay quiet, nod, sign the paper, pay the fine, disappear. But Ariana Lowell didn't come here to disappear. She stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady and low, "we haven't begun. I have not been informed of the charges. No evidence has been presented. No files have been opened. I respectfully request the right to a proper defense, as afforded by due legal process." Blackstone leaned back, visibly annoyed. "You violated the law. A defense is unnecessary." "Under Georgia state law," she continued calmly, "no ruling can be issued without public disclosure of evidence and a reasonable opportunity for the accused to respond." "I am the law in this courtroom, not you," Blackstone snapped, his voice not loud but cold as stone. "You're not here to give a lecture. You're here to comply." Ariana stood tall. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. But her eyes, dark and sharp, now carried something beyond politeness. A warning. From the prosecution table, the attorney shifted in his seat. It was becoming clear. This wasn't going to be a routine hearing. "Your Honor," Ariana pressed on, still even tone, "I request that the hearing proceed by proper protocol, with evidence presented, with the right to cross-examination, and if necessary, with federal oversight." That last phrase, federal oversight, was a precise cut, subtle but sharp. In that instant, Judge Blackstone froze. Just for half a second, but enough for anyone watching to see. He hadn't expected to be challenged. He said nothing, just stared at her, then suddenly declared, "Court is in recess for 15 minutes. And he stood up, said nothing more. Disappeared behind the thick courtroom door. The room was silent. The court clerk looked up, hands trembling slightly above the keyboard. The prosecutor now looked at Ariana, for the first time, with a cautious respect. Ariana didn't move. Her hand rested on the worn leather briefcase. She didn't turn, didn't scan the room. She was listening to how the atmosphere had shifted from dismissive to alert. And then something small happened. A thin sheet of paper slipped from the judge's robe as he exited, landing near the door. The bailiff bent down, picked it up, glanced at it, and then, almost subconsciously, looked at Ariana. For a moment, their eyes met, and she understood. This courtroom had handled cases like this before, but perhaps they had never met someone like her. No one in the room spoke as the door to the judge's chambers clicked shut. There was a weight that spread across the space, not fear, but awareness. Everyone could feel it. They were witnessing something that wasn't supposed to happen. And standing at the center of it all, Ariana Lowell remained like an unmoving pillar. No leaning back, no checking her phone, no flipping through files. Her hand rested gently on her father's old brown leather briefcase, her breathing steady, as if she were counting the seconds until the truth revealed itself. In the back left corner of the courtroom, the prosecutor, Grant Tulliver, finally sat down, his brow furrowed like a man who just realized he no longer knew the path this hearing was taking. Just moments ago, he thought this would be a routine session. Fast, clean, by the book. The defendant would be fined, the prosecutor wouldn't need to say a word, the judge would rule, and the case would close. But now he found himself caught in the middle, between a power structure that had clearly preset the outcome and a lone woman using sheer logic to bend every imposed rule back into the shape of justice. Ariana wasn't standing there to perform. She stood because she knew. Judge Blackstone hadn't left to reflect. He had left to calculate, to make calls, to speak with superiors, or worse, to find a way to discredit her before she could expose what was really happening in that room. And she knew something else too. To those who've grown used to unchecked power, nothing is more threatening than the calm of someone who knows they are right. In those still moments, Ariana thought of her father, Mr. Lowell. He had taught her that the law was not a club to swing, but a lantern, the only thing that could illuminate the truth of a courtroom. Years ago, he had been wrongly sentenced in a similar administrative hearing by a judge who hadn't even let him speak. He never made it out of prison. Ariana, only 19 at the time, had sat in the courtroom, unable to say a word, unable to stop anything. That helplessness, it no longer lived in her. The sharp click of the door opening startled the room, but it wasn't the judge who stepped out first. It was the bailiff, Officer Nathan, who gave a slight nod to the courtroom guard and whispered something. Seconds later, a courthouse staffer wearing a federal oversight badge entered. No announcement, no fuss. But everyone understood. The higher-ups had been alerted. A few more minutes passed. The door opened again. This time, Judge Blackstone returned. His eyes no longer carried the same easy contempt as before, but still held the quiet confidence of a man who'd worn power too long to ever feel the need to apologize. He approached the bench, adjusted the collar of his robe as if rearming himself with authority, and tapped the desk lightly once. The court will resume. Due to certain procedural concerns, I have invited Federal Judge Theodore Wilkins to join and oversee the remainder of this hearing. The room froze in a prolonged silence. A federal judge? At a civil administrative hearing? This wasn't protocol. This was urgent. Every eye turned toward the door, where a tall, commanding older man with neatly trimmed silver hair stepped in without announcement. He didn't need to say a word. His presence spoke for itself. Wilkins didn't look at anyone else. He looked directly at Ariana. His eyes were sharp, like a man who had presided over thousands of cases, yet still knew how to separate truth from theatrics. He gave a slight nod, not a greeting, but an acknowledgement. I see you. Judge Wilkins took the seat beside Blackstone. There was no need for introductions. Every legal professional in Georgia knew his name. He had once overseen the landmark case against illegal home seizures in Charleston in 2020, where he ruled against the entire city council. Blackstone adjusted his microphone but said nothing more. He let Wilkins take up the space. Ariana understood. This was the turning point. She also understood that she was no longer standing in front of a single unjust courtroom. She was facing an entire system. And for the first time in her life, that system was finally looking back at her. Judge Wilkins was the first to speak. Ms. Lowell, you've made a procedural objection regarding the handling of this hearing and the imposed administrative fine. I'd like you to restate your position clearly for the federal record. Ariana nodded. She didn't look at her papers. She didn't need to. Every word was etched into her, not memorized but lived. Your Honor, I have been issued an administrative fine of $35,000 under Code 18A without prior notice, without the right to respond, without the presentation of physical evidence, without witnesses, and without adherence to due process as outlined in the procedural charter. She lifted her head, meeting Wilkins' eyes directly. This is not merely a procedural failure. It is a textbook example of power used as a weapon. This fine is not born of law, but of attitude, of bias, of a disregard for legal standards. Not a soul in the courtroom moved, Ariana continued. And I am not the first, but I will not be the last to stay silent. Wilkins slowly nodded. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, a subtle signal inviting her to continue. She understood. The battle hadn't begun in full, but for the first time, she knew they were listening. No sound broke the long silence that followed Ariana's final statement. But this wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the stillness of people beginning to realize they were witnessing something rare. The truth being spoken, coldly, precisely, and undeniably. Judge Wilkins tilted his head slightly toward Blackstone. He didn't look at him. He simply spoke in a calm, even tone. The court will now hear evidentiary support. Without waiting for an invitation, Ariana leaned down to her worn leather briefcase, its edges now visibly marked by time. She didn't flip through papers to search. Everything was prepared, meticulously labeled, tabbed, organized, like blueprints drawn specifically for this day. She placed 3 folders on the desk. Sullivan v. State of Illinois, 2017, she said, her voice steady, not sharp, but each word landing like nails into wood. An appellate court overturned a $10,500 fine due to lack of photographic evidence, no inspection report, no witnesses, only a one-sided statement from the enforcement officer. She paused. The room remained silent, but the court reporter's breath caught audibly. precisely at the phrase, "only a one-sided statement." Ariana looked directly toward the prosecution table, where Grant Tulliver now sat upright, pulled into this hearing more forcibly than he'd ever intended. In its opinion, the court wrote, "Where there is no evidence, there can be no enforcement. The integrity of the judicial process demands more than speculation." Wilkins raised an eyebrow, nodding ever so slightly, a silent sign of acknowledgement. Ariana flipped to the second file. Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg, 2019. A police officer issued a citation based on visual judgment, with no photos, no footage, no witnesses. The city defended it as common practice. The court rejected that defense. It ruled that no administrative action exists in a vacuum. Without verifiable data, no penalty can be sustained. At this point, Grant glanced toward Blackstone, his lips pressed tight, eyes flickering with tension. He understood now, and perhaps for the first time in this entire hearing, that the tide was turning. Ariana continued slowly, eyes fixed ahead. That case was upheld at the federal level. The court affirmed that administrative fines, if not accompanied by physical evidence, are unconstitutional. She stepped slightly closer to the center of the courtroom. No one stopped her. No one interrupted. She didn't need to raise her voice. The weight came from the precision. Sharp, clear, unrelenting. "And now," she said, her gaze passing between both judges, "we have a $35,000 fine being imposed without photos, videos, incident reports, witnesses, timestamps, or any publicly presented documentation. The only basis provided is the subjective perception of the issuing officer." No one spoke. Judge Wilkins set his pen down. He didn't write. He didn't ask questions. He simply looked up, directly at Ariana, as if to ask with his eyes, "Is there more?" There was. "This is no longer about me," Ariana said, her tone softening slightly, but her edge remained. "This is about a system that chooses instinct over evidence. And at that moment, it stops being justice. It becomes authoritarianism wearing a righteous face." At the back of the courtroom, a young woman, dressed in a postal worker's uniform, clenched her fist slightly when she heard that. She had once been fined $1,200 for stopping her truck 3 minutes outside the designated delivery zone. No photo, no explanation. She had stayed silent. Today, she no longer felt alone. Wilkins turned toward Blackstone, but didn't ask anything. He didn't need to. And that, more than anything, made Blackstone lean back slightly in his chair. A subconscious reflex of a man sensing that his power had begun to fracture. Ariana didn't smile, didn't gloat. She knew they were nowhere near finished, but she also knew the scales had begun to shift. Not because of emotion, not because of outrage, but because of law, because of truth, because of a kind of power that no one grants you, one that the brave must claim for themselves. Judge Derek Blackstone sat motionless behind the bench, his eyes no longer cold or indifferent, but guarded. He didn't raise the gavel. He didn't object, but he didn't nod either. The way he looked at Ariana now wasn't the usual disdain of someone sitting high above. It was the look of a man calculating how to retreat without losing face. Ariana could feel it, not just in his gaze, but in the smallest shifts across the room. From where she stood, she could hear the soft, repetitive tapping of the judge's finger on the desk. Slow, sharp, involuntary. At the prosecution table, Grant Tulliver had stopped taking notes. He sat still, trying to figure out if he was still part of this story or just a background character in a trial that had spun out of orbit. At the center of the courtroom, Ariana continued. She didn't move much, didn't pace, but every word she spoke pulled on something invisible, a force that bent the air between logic and authority. "Your Honor," she said, eyes fixed on Blackstone, "no justice begins in silence and ends in orders. Power cannot replace evidence. Emotion cannot replace process." Wilkins nodded very slightly, almost imperceptibly, but Ariana saw it. It wasn't agreement. It was acknowledgement. She had struck a nerve in the system. Blackstone suddenly leaned toward the microphone. "Ms. Lowell," he said, voice deeper, "you're standing in a courtroom, not a classroom. If you'd rather be a professor, Find a lecture hall. The comment was crafted to undercut, to kill the momentum. A personal jab, shallow but sharp. The goal, shift the hearing from fact to feeling. But Ariana had seen that tactic hundreds of times, in cases where those in power knew they'd run out of legal ground to stand on. She didn't take the bait. "Sir," she replied, voice steady, neither lowered nor raised, "I'm not here to teach anyone. I'm here to be heard. But if the court won't listen and won't allow a defense, then this isn't a place of law. It's just a room with a microphone and a man in a robe." The final words struck like a slow gavel pounding on cold wood. A woman in the back quietly whispered, "Wow." But the room had already shifted. Grant Tulliver cleared his throat. Blackstone shifted in his seat, glancing around as if gauging how much support he still had. But everyone, the stenographer, the court officers, the public, had their eyes on Ariana, not him. She continued, this time slower, each word like ice poured into hot water. "I'm not afraid of silence, but I won't accept coercion. The truth doesn't need politeness to be heard. It just needs enough patience to stand firm when all that's left is excuses." She opened her briefcase, pulled out a new folder, thinner this time, marked with a red stamp. "Related to abuse of power, internal oversight file." She raised it slightly but didn't open it. She let it rest in front of Wilkins, a silent message. "I have more, and I'm ready to present it, if needed." Wilkins folded his arms, his eyes never leaving hers. Blackstone looked down at the bench. 1 second. 2. Then he inhaled deeply, speaking like a man forced to compromise, but still trying to sound in control. "Ms. Lowell, if you believe there has been serious misconduct in this proceeding, you may file a formal objection with the Administrative Oversight Court." Ariana smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was the smile of someone who'd heard those words a dozen times and knew they were just a polished delay tactic. "Sir," she said, "today I'm not filing. I'm not sending an email. I'm not waiting 30 days for a reply. I'm not representing a person or a case file. I'm representing the process that you skipped, and today I'm here to reclaim it." She raised her head, for the first time looking directly at the entire room. "Not just for me, for everyone who doesn't get to sit here. The ones who get fined, evicted, stripped of their rights, all because of a signature, a nod, a professional judgment, and they have no lawyer, no folder, no chance." The breathing in the gallery grew louder. Someone gripped the edge of their chair. A middle-aged man pulled out his phone to record, hands trembling, but steady enough. And at the center, Ariana Lowell didn't back away, didn't raise her voice, but it was clear. The power in the room had shifted. She continued, "Because if I can be fined $35,000 without evidence, without process, without verification, then it doesn't stop with me. It can happen to anyone in this room. And if we allow that, it will keep happening." No one objected. No one interrupted. Even Blackstone, the man who opened this hearing with a pre-written sentence, no longer had the steam to cut her off. She placed the folder on the table. "We have 2 choices, Your Honor. We can use the law to silence, or we can use the law to listen. I choose the latter, and I'm not leaving this room until everyone here understands that." Wilkins said nothing, but his hand moved, lightly turning the folder toward him. It wasn't courtesy, it was recognition. Outside the courtroom, a crowd of reporters had gathered around the live stream feed. Comments poured across the screen. "Who is she? $35,000? No evidence. WTF. This is why I've lost faith in the system. She's got my support." And inside, courtroom 4C was no longer just an administrative space. It had become a stage where a system was being forced to listen to the voice it once tried to bury. And Ariana Lowell? She was still standing, but now she was no longer standing alone. Judge Blackstone remained seated at the highest bench in the courtroom, as if trying to maintain balance between authority and confusion. Since Ariana began presenting legal precedents, he hadn't dared to openly object, but he clearly had no intention of surrendering his position either. His fingers kept tapping the wooden surface, each thud dry and uneven. It wasn't the rhythm of thinking, it was the rhythm of tension slipping out of control. Beside him, federal judge Theodore Wilkins remained still. But unlike Blackstone, his stillness wasn't from discomfort. It was the quiet of someone observing. Every word, every glance, every pause. The courtroom was no longer just a venue for an administrative violation. It had become a magnifying glass, reflecting a system beginning to feel ashamed of itself. Ariana knew it was time to move from precedent to fact, from theory to reality, from law to human impact. She opened the fourth folder, no labels, no colored tabs, just a brown envelope, neatly stapled shut. "Your Honors," she said, her voice a bit lower, but steady and unshaken. "I request to call the sole witness listed in the report, Officer Matthew Gage." No objections, no movement. The court officer turned toward the back door, where Gage entered in a crisp uniform, name tag glinting under the fluorescent lights. He looked to be in his 50s, broad-shouldered, stone-faced, walking like someone who'd entered courtrooms 100 times before. Gage placed his left hand on the Bible, raised his right, and repeated the oath like a machine. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." He then sat down, hands on his thighs, back straight like a statue. He didn't look at Ariana. She didn't show hostility, didn't raise tension. Her first question came gently. "Officer Gage, you're the one who filed the violation report under Code 18A against me on the 4th of last month, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Gage replied without hesitation. "And what did you base the violation on?" "I observed it firsthand. There was a clear infraction, an improper parking violation in a government zone." "Did you record the scene?" "No need. I know a violation when I see one." "Did you take any photographs?" "No." "Were there any security cameras capturing the event?" "I didn't check." "Any other witnesses at the scene?" "Number, I handled it alone." Ariana tilted her head slightly, eyes still on Gage. "Did you file a detailed incident report noting time, location, and conditions?" "No detailed report. I followed the standard citation template. No diagram, no written description, no photos, no witness statements." Gage's brow furrowed. "Not necessary. I've been doing this job 26 years. I know what I'm doing." Ariana smiled, just enough to be polite, but clearly signaling, "I was waiting for that." "Sir," she said, "with all due respect for your experience, there is no statute that says 26 years of service can replace video evidence." Whispers stirred in the room. A law student near the door scribbled notes into a notebook, his hand slightly shaking. Grant Tulliver, the prosecutor, folded his hands in front of him, eyes down, avoiding Gage's gaze. Ariana stepped calmly toward the bench, her voice level. "Your Honors, the entire $35,000 fine was issued based on a single sheet of paper, authored by one individual, without any supporting evidence, documentation, or corroborating testimony. This isn't law enforcement. It's judgment by assumption, emotion, and impression." She turned back to Gage. "If a citizen can be fined $35,000 simply because an officer believes they committed a violation, without evidence, without verification, then are we still calling this an administrative process? Or are we calling it licensed personal intuition? You call that enforcement. I call it a uniformed misjudgment." The room fell completely silent. Even Wilkins had stopped tapping his pen. He simply watched. Blackstone had his arms folded. No more tapping, no more leaning. Just sitting there, frozen under the weight of an argument too precise to deny. Ariana lowered her voice. "Your Honors, I'm not standing here to slander anyone. I'm not against Officer Gage. I'm against the way we've allowed a single piece of paper to determine someone's fate, without anything but a few handwritten lines. The law cannot be based on memory, and justice cannot live in a feeling." A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. An elderly man squeezed his wife's hand. A young woman seated in the back wiped away a tear with a tissue. She whispered to her friend, "This happened to my mom." And Ariana, she stood tall, no raised voice, no theatrical gestures, because she understood. It's not the shouting that makes people listen. It's the voice that doesn't shake. Officer Matthew Gage remained seated on the witness stand, but his back was no longer as straight as when he first entered. His hands, once resting calmly on his thighs, were now clenched. His eyes stared into the space ahead. Not at Ariana, not anymore. He knew. Everyone in the courtroom knew. The era when a uniform and a statement like, "I know what I saw," could silence a room was over. At the bench, Judge Blackstone leaned slightly forward, fingers tapping gently. But unlike before, the rhythm was broken, staggered, like a machine still running, but clicking and rattling because something inside had come loose. This wasn't the sound of thought. It was the sound of a man trying to hold on to his image while everything beneath him was slipping out of control. Judge Wilkins remained still, his gaze focused on Gage. Not cold, not tense. Just the eyes of someone who had heard too many defenses and too little truth. When he tilted his head slightly toward Ariana, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Ms. Lowell," he said, voice low but clear, like a conductor lifting his hand before a symphony's climax. "Please repeat your last question, for the record." Ariana nodded. She stepped toward the defense table, unhurried. "Officer Gage," she said, eyes steady on him, "if someone were to contest the fine you issued, as I am doing, can you present any physical evidence to support your claim?" Gage licked his lips. A small gesture, but it spoke volumes. I would say I acted based on my experience and professional training." Ariana didn't smile, didn't nod. She simply repeated his words slowly. "So we have a $35,000 fine, no images, no witnesses, no site report, based solely on professional intuition?" The room froze. No one moved. That question wasn't just for Gage. It was a quiet bullet aimed at the system itself. A system where trust was given to the badge, not the evidence. Wilkins gave a subtle nod. "I've heard enough," he said, interrupting for the first time. Not out of anger, but because it was time to bring part of this to a close. He turned to Blackstone. "Colleague," he said, still composed, "we are reviewing an allegation without physical evidence, without proper legal procedure, and without permitting the accused to defend herself. Under federal standards, I believe a reassessment of the fine's legitimacy is necessary." Blackstone cleared his throat. "We may consider local context in this case, especially given the officer's tenure." Wilkins cut him off. For the first time in the entire hearing, he interrupted Blackstone, and no one in the room took it as rude. "Tenure cannot replace evidence, colleague," he said, "and authority cannot stand above process." The courtroom almost trembled, not from noise, but from the dense silence that followed. Spectators glanced at one another. No one spoke, but inside something had broken open. Ariana stood motionless. She didn't show victory. She didn't nod. She knew this wasn't the time to celebrate. It was the time to do what the system fears most: make people think. She lowered her voice, facing both judges, delivering a closing line as sharp as a scalpel. "Due process is not a menu item we pick and choose based on taste. It is the foundation. And if today we let it crack, even one brick, then tomorrow there'll be nothing left standing." A woman in the front row, wearing a delivery company uniform, dabbed her tears. She didn't know Ariana, but she had just realized someone had spoken for her. Wilkins stayed silent for a few more seconds. Then he turned to Blackstone, and his gaze no longer carried sharpness, but weight, the gaze of someone compelling a colleague to face the truth. "Judge Blackstone, your court imposed a $35,000 fine without permitting a hearing, without requesting evidence, and without conducting due process. Before I make a formal recommendation, would you like to issue any corrections?" Blackstone looked down. The pen in his hand didn't move. His right hand trembled slightly, just a little, but enough for Ariana to notice. Enough for the entire courtroom to sense that the gavel no longer held the weight it once did. He cleared his throat, voice raspy. "The court will review the fine, temporarily suspend enforcement, to reassess with additional evidence." Ariana gave a slight bow, not in gratitude, but as an unspoken message. That should have happened before I walked in here. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the air in that courtroom had changed forever. Courtroom 4C had fallen into a strange kind of quiet. No coughing, no creaking chairs. No one glanced at their phones or checked their watches. Every eye was fixed on even the smallest movements in that now familiar space. A room where power had long been exercised in silence and was now suddenly being forced to listen. Ariana Lowell was still standing. She hadn't moved from the center since the hearing began, but something about her presence had shifted how the room saw her. At first, she was a tough attorney, then a woman bold enough to speak out, then a citizen refusing to be silent. But now, it was something more. Judge Wilkins held a pen but didn't write. His eyes weren't just analyzing arguments. They were studying, as if trying to piece together an image he'd seen before. Her calm demeanor, her flawless documentation, the way she cited precedent, not a single word misplaced, the way she handled the witness without missing a step, the way she stood, unshaken by authority, not typical of someone fresh in the field. He knew. She wasn't just anyone, and he wasn't the only one beginning to realize it. In the back row, a young local news reporter, hair tied in a tight bun, glanced down at her phone. On the screen, the name Ariana Lowell had started to appear across internal legal news feeds. A few leaked links, a blurry photo from a state-level hearing in Oregon, a government interview that had since been scrubbed from the agency website. The reporter's eyes widened. A whisper escaped her lips, almost involuntarily. "It's her. It's really her." No one heard, but they didn't have to, because seconds later, a man in a gray suit, a federal court staffer standing near Wilkins, leaned in and whispered something into his ear. Wilkins raised his eyebrows, just slightly, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. The atmosphere shifted instantly. No one spoke it out loud, but everyone felt it. The name Ariana Lowell wasn't new to the system. The system had simply forgotten her, or tried to. Wilkins folded his hands, eyes on Ariana. "Ms. Lowell," he said slower than before, "I have a question, not listed in the case file." Ariana nodded, steady. "I'm prepared to answer. You previously served as a policy advisor for the Federal Administrative Procedure Commission, correct?" A very brief pause flickered in Ariana's eyes, not from surprise, but from the realization that the recognition had arrived sooner than she expected. She nodded. "Yes, I served as an advisor for 18 months, helping draft revised administrative penalty guidelines for 12 states and territories, focused on evidence-free enforcement procedures, including statutes similar to Code 18A currently being applied here." The room fell silent. Grant Tulliver turned to look at her, as if only now realizing he had spent the past hour trying to defend a law in front of the woman who had helped rewrite it. Judge Blackstone said nothing, but his expression tightened. His hand gripped the arm of his chair. Her name, now he remembered. She was the one he brushed off at a conference in Nashville. The one who wrote the internal memo identifying 37 constitutional violations in the administrative penalty frameworks of major cities. The one other judges called the smart problem because she never raised her voice, but every time she spoke, their policies had to be rewritten. Wilkins nodded slowly, his voice low, as if confirming it to himself. "You didn't come here to file a complaint. You came to test the system you helped reform." Ariana didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't move. "I came here," she said, "not to prove I was right. I came to see if the regulations we created, after every wrongful ruling, every internal audit, every public apology, actually exist in real life." She inhaled, revealing emotion for the first time. "And if I, someone with access to the law, can be fined $35,000 without a hearing, without evidence, without rebuttal, then how many people out there, without documentation, without knowledge, without a voice, have already been crushed by this system and forgotten?" Outside the courtroom, a crowd was forming. The live stream had surpassed 500,000 viewers. Comments exploded across the feed. "She's the one who wrote the law they're using against her? Jesus, this is the plot twist of the year. I'm crying right now. My mom was fined $3,000 over a clerical error. Now I finally understand what happened." Inside, Wilkins leaned back slightly, his eyes scanning the case file in front of him, as if what he saw now was no longer just a case, but a portrait of a system that had strayed far from its oath. As for Judge Blackstone, he sat still. No more tapping, No gestures. He knew. The wave he once thought he could manage now stood in front of him with a name, a voice, and a legacy. Ariana didn't need to shout. She didn't need a title. She only needed the truth, and she had just shown the system. It no longer controlled who gets to speak. And you? Have you ever wondered what happens when the person being judged isn't just a lawyer, but the very person who wrote the law they're now being judged under? Stay tuned for the next episode, where a long-buried truth resurfaces and the entire system begins to realize they just picked the last person they should have tried to silence. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss a single part of the story that's making America stop and listen. When the courtroom doors opened once more, the entire room seemed to lean toward the sound, as if even the softest movement could send the last fragile pieces of power crashing to the floor. A court staffer in a gray suit stepped in and handed Judge Wilkins a printed packet, folded neatly in a folder bearing the seal of the United States Federal Court. Wilkins skimmed a few lines, then nodded, this time not as an observer, but as a man moving into action. He looked up, his voice still calm and even, but there was something beneath it now, like a blade quietly drawn from its sheath. I have received federal verification regarding attorney Ariana Lowell. As suspected, she is not merely a civil attorney. Ms. Lowell is a co-author of the Federal Guidelines for Administrative Procedure and Evidentiary Standards for Penalty Enforcement, first issued in 2021 and adopted by 12 states. A sharp exhale could be heard somewhere in the courtroom. Wilkins continued, she personally drafted Chapter 3, Section 7, which explicitly states that any administrative fine exceeding $10,000 must be accompanied by at least one of the following: photographic evidence of the incident, a certified incident report, or testimony from an independent witness. He looked directly at Blackstone, no longer with the eyes of a colleague, but like someone reading aloud from a manual the other had once sworn to uphold, and chose to ignore. And today, Wilkins said, voice dropping by half a tone, the very law co-authored by Miss Lowell has been ignored, in one of the first courts that pledged to implement it. Ariana said nothing. She didn't need to. The courtroom no longer required her to prove anything. Her silence, calm, unshaken, was the loudest indictment of all. Blackstone clasped his hands, but his fingers visibly trembled. He exhaled, short and strained, as if even he no longer knew what image he was supposed to maintain. Every ounce of authority he had built over the years, stamping decisions, issuing fines, denying appeals, was now collapsing under the very thing he once swore to protect. Wilkins wasn't finished. In addition, he said, lifting the file slightly, this packet includes an internal report written by Ms. Lowell last year, citing 12 state-level cases of misapplied administrative statutes, including a nearly identical case in Fulton County, Georgia, where we are seated today. A slap made of paper. No one said a word. A woman in the back, and silent since the beginning, began to cry. The person beside her reached over and gently held her hand. In their eyes wasn't just sympathy, but realization. She didn't just speak for us. She wrote the laws meant to protect us. And today the system forgot who wrote them. Wilkins placed the folder on the bench, then spoke again. Judge Blackstone, I am not here to do your job, but as the federal oversight authority, I have a duty to speak. And to my knowledge, no court has the right to issue a penalty exceeding $10,000 without adhering to the evidentiary standards outlined in these guidelines, especially not when the defendant is one of the document's original authors. Prosecutor Grant Tulliver exhaled hard and lowered his head, not in shame, but because he realized he too had climbed onto the wrong side of a case everyone thought would be quick. Blackstone, now with nothing left to lean on, finally spoke. His voice had turned hoarse. The court was unaware of the defendant's identity at the time of judgment. Ariana looked up. For the first time during the hearing, her voice carried a chill. And if I hadn't said anything, if I were just a single mother, a postal worker, a retired man who doesn't know how to send an email, would you still have issued a $35,000 fine? Blackstone didn't answer, because he couldn't. Wilkins gave a slow nod, a gesture that felt like the final bow of a justice system that had forgotten its own promises. As for Ariana, She didn't declare victory, because this wasn't about winning or losing. She needed the system to look at itself. She needed the people outside this courtroom, those who'd paid fines in silence, who'd been denied appeals, who'd lost everything over a piece of paper with no evidence or explanation, to hear one thing clearly. Justice is not something you grant us. It is something we have the right to demand. And today she had demanded it, in the very language she once wrote it in. Courtroom 4C was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Judge Blackstone sat like stone. The face that once radiated cold authority had now been stripped of its armor. And beside him, Judge Wilkins didn't need to say another word, because everything that needed to be said had already been spoken by the woman standing at the center of the room. Ariana stood there, her right hand resting lightly on her worn leather briefcase, her head slightly tilted toward the bench, but her eyes facing the gallery. No more arguments, no more citations, no more statutes, only people. I was able to defend myself, she began, her voice neither raised nor pressed, but every syllable pierced the air thick with reckoning. Because I know the law, because I have access, because I know when to unzip a file, when to speak, and when to hold silence. She took a long breath, then slowly pulled out 3 sheets of paper. No page numbers, no official seals. Just plain, worn A4 pages with crumpled corners, as if they had been folded and unfolded many times. But some people can't defend themselves, she said, because the system never wanted them to know they had rights. She lifted the first page. Her voice was no longer that of a lawyer. It was the voice of someone reading names off a gravestone. Daniel King, veteran, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Came home from Iraq with shrapnel in one leg and a dream in his heart that he could fix cars for kids in the neighborhood, free of charge. He opened a small garage, no signage, just a handmade wooden board. This place fixes cars for those who need it. One day the city sent an email. His license was suspended due to a missing checkbox on a form. No call, no warning, no explanation, just one red line of text. Ariana paused, looked down at the paper. Daniel lost most of his customers in a week, couldn't pay rent. 3 months later, he left his mobile home with a handwritten note. I tried, but maybe trying isn't enough. Silence. No one moved. Ariana held up the second page. Karen Bautista, Savannah, Georgia, electrician, state certified, 0 accidents in 15 years. She led the region's first all-female electrical team, helping hundreds of workers learn the trade, until one morning the building department changed a regulation. Without public notice, Karen's license was marked non-transferable. No one could explain what it meant. She lost her permits, couldn't apply for new ones, couldn't work. She requested a copy of the regulation. The answer? Internal document, not public. Ariana lowered the paper, closing her eyes for just a second. She lost her crew, lost her contracts, lost her home, moved to Florida to start over. No one ever apologized. A quiet sob broke in the room. A woman buried her head in her hands. Ariana held up the final page. James Weller, 62 years old, long-haul trucker for over 30 years, used his retirement to buy a small plot outside Waco, Texas. Built a cedar fence by hand, each post a day's labor. That fence, according to the city, extended 17 inches into public boundary. Fine, $10,800. When he asked for a resurvey, the response was, decision made, no further review. Ariana looked down at the paper. Her eyes were red, but her voice held steady. He tore down the fence with bare hands in 2 days. On the 3rd day, the city fined him again. Fence removed improperly. She set the paper down. The room held its breath, not because there was nothing more to say, but because no one knew how to respond. Ariana stepped slowly to the center of the courtroom, stopping where the sunlight from the skylight hit her the strongest. These people didn't have lawyers, no live stream, no reporters. And every time the system says, we're sorry, a life has already lost a chapter it will never get back. She turned to Judge Wilkins, then straight to Blackstone. They don't need apologies. They need justice, delivered in time, not after everything has been broken. Her voice lowered. They need you to say we were wrong, and this time, to say it while it still matters. Wilkins tightened his grip on the armrest. He looked down, not to avoid her, but to ground himself against the flood of emotion rising in his chest. A rare moment for someone in power, being forced to listen not as a title, but as a human being. Blackstone didn't speak, but he didn't have to. His silence now was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of reckoning. And Ariana Lowell? She didn't say another word. No closing statement. No gratitude. She simply walked back to her seat, for the first time since the hearing began, and sat down. But everyone in that courtroom knew. Today, 3 names had been rescued from oblivion. No longer unidentified victims. No longer closed cases. No longer internal matters. They were Daniel, Karen, James. And thanks to Ariana, they were back, with real names, real stories, and truths the system could no longer pretend not to see. The courtroom remained silent, like a chapel after confession. Ariana had taken her seat, but the words she left behind still lingered in the air, drifting like smoke, and no one dared breathe too hard, afraid to disturb them. Judge Blackstone sat motionless. Throughout the hearing, he had gone from commanding to defensive to exposed. No more shields for the authority he once believed to be untouchable. No more internal procedure. No more judicial discretion. Only one option remained: bow his head or bury himself beneath the weight of the paperwork he once signed with impunity. Judge Wilkins sat upright. No gavel was needed. He didn't strike the bench. He didn't interrupt. He allowed the silence to live, to speak for itself. A silence that reminded everyone. Some verdicts don't need to be loud, only unmistakable. He spoke slowly. Based on the testimony under oath, the evidence presented, and the legal precedents cited, this court concludes that the $35,000 administrative fine issued against Ms. Ariana Lowell lacks sufficient legal basis. The room exhaled, not in victory, but in relief. Justice had finally spoken. Wilkins continued. The fine is fully vacated. The violation record shall be erased from the administrative enforcement system. The issuing agency is required to review its procedures under supervision of the Federal Inspector General's office. Blackstone gave a slight nod, not to Wilkins, not to Ariana. Just a mechanical motion, as if he knew any further resistance would only drag him deeper. And for him, silence had become the kindest act left. Wilkins did not turn to Ariana. He only said one short sentence, a message that stretched beyond the boundaries of the courtroom. Thank you for not staying silent as the system once hoped you would. That was it. No applause, no curtain call, no soundtrack swelling at the end. Ariana rose, calmly folded her papers, and slipped them back into her old leather briefcase. She didn't bow, didn't wave. She simply left the courtroom, the same way she had entered, composed, alone, and not needing anyone to validate her worth. But this time, as she walked out, everyone stood. No one chanted her name. No signs were held. They just stood, a quiet gesture that said, "We heard you, and we understood." The delivery woman placed her hand over her heart. The law student closed his notebook, but didn't zip it shut. He knew he'd read it again. An older black man in a worn suit leaned to the person beside him and whispered, "She didn't just win a case. She woke up a courtroom that had been asleep." Outside, the clouds had cleared. Sunlight poured through the aging glass dome of the courthouse like a soft goodbye. Ariana stepped through the doors unhurried. The wind played gently through her hair, carrying the scent of April. The smell of something quietly beginning again. A reporter raised a microphone, but no one pushed. No cameras rushed forward. A woman holding her phone on live stream simply said, "We just witnessed something the system should have done long ago. Listen, understand, and make it right." Ariana didn't look at the lens. She just smiled faintly, like someone who knew the most important things had already been said in that room. And now it was no longer about speaking. It was about doing. She walked on, and beneath her feet, the steps of the Fulton County Courthouse were no longer obstacles. They had become the first steps towards something better. 3 days after the hearing at Fulton, a quiet headline appeared on the front page of the New York Times. The woman who rewrote the law and then used it to stop the machine. No dramatic photo, no slogan. Just a black and white image of Ariana Lowell exiting the courtroom, eyes slightly downcast, her hand holding the leather briefcase, and behind her, the heavy courthouse door swinging shut. And then, like a chain reaction, the aftershock began to unfold. In Cleveland, a group of law students held an open forum titled "Due Process is Not Optional," with over 500 attendees, many crowding the hallways. In Phoenix, a man named Ray Chalmers, previously fined $4,200 for improper curb alignment, filed a motion to reopen his case, attaching a clip of Ariana's closing arguments from a live stream. In the small town of Springfield, Missouri, a 76-year-old woman named Jeanette Cunningham submitted a handwritten petition to her city council, calling for a full review of over 300 administrative fines issued over 5 years. The opening line, penned in shaky cursive, "If she had the courage to stand in that courtroom, I can no longer remain silent." The media couldn't look away. CNN launched a special feature titled, "When the System Fights Back and Gets Corrected." 60 Minutes aired a segment interviewing individuals fined without evidence, ending with the host's solemn words, "Some hearings don't deliver verdicts, they deliver standards." On social media, the hashtag The Lowell Doctrine exploded, shared over 3.2 million times in 48 hours. A Twitter thread summarizing the hearing went viral, drawing 9 million views with just one caption. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, but the whole system had to stop and listen to her. Meanwhile, at the Federal Administrative Justice Council headquarters, an internal memo was circulated, announcing a comprehensive review of all local and county-level administrative enforcement protocols. The stated purpose? To reaffirm the enforceability of standards co-authored by senior legal advisor Lowell following multiple instances of judicial noncompliance. Ariana declined all interviews. She didn't speak to reporters. She turned down an invitation to appear on Stephen Colbert's Friday night show. She didn't share anything online. She didn't have to, because what she said in that courtroom had become the voice of millions. From Minnesota to New Mexico, city councils, courtrooms, and even local permit offices began hearing echoes from Fulton. A warning that justice isn't defined by titles, but by a system's willingness to hold itself accountable. In Houston, a 19-year-old student who had been evicted from her dorm for missing a license renewal by 3 days filed her first appeal. On the final line of the form, she wrote, "Because the system is supposed to listen, not just decide." In Chicago, a single father named Marcus Scott returned to City Hall to request a review of his $1,300 fine from the previous year, a citation he had never received photographic evidence for. When the clerk asked why, he held up a phone playing a clip of Ariana reading aloud the names of 3 forgotten citizens. "I don't want mine to be the 4th, he said. The story had moved beyond the law. It had become a social movement, not organized, not branded, not funded. Just ordinary people refusing to remain quietly compliant. They didn't riot. They didn't scream. They simply asked to be heard and answered with evidence, not assumptions." A new phrase began to appear in hundreds of letters sent to courthouses and city councils. If the woman who wrote the law could be silenced, then what chance do the rest of us have? And so, the aftershock reached beyond the public. Judges, once treating administrative enforcement as minor matters, began to regroup. In Pennsylvania, a coalition of district judges issued a joint statement calling for new training sessions on defendants' rights during administrative hearings. Colorado passed a statewide rule requiring all fines over $5,000 to include time-stamped photographic or field evidence. The Sacramento Office of Internal Oversight began auditing over 900 past cases and voided 87 citations in just the first 48 hours. It all began with a single hearing where a woman stood in the middle of a courtroom. No yelling, no desk slamming, no demand for special treatment, just a demand for proper procedure. And like dominoes, the system began to tremble. Not because she called for a revolution, but because she followed the law better than anyone who had ever sat in judgment of it. Judge Wilkins, in a brief interview with NPR, was asked how he felt about the hearing at Fulton. He replied with one sentence, "It was the first time I saw someone move the entire system without raising their voice." It was also the first time my judge's bench felt lighter than the responsibility I was carrying. This story had outgrown legal textbooks. It had become a generational reminder that silence cannot be the only strategy for surviving a system built on paperwork and too few human faces. And the most remarkable part? The woman who lit that fire never asked anyone to follow. She just stood tall, spoke calmly, and refused to step back, even when the whole room turned away. That morning, Atlanta was unremarkable. No protests, no press conferences, no live streams. Local TV ran weather updates and fuel prices. Traffic clogged the roads like always. Coffee still got cold too fast if you didn't drink it in time. But inside an aging concrete building at the corner of 213th Street, in a small room where a month earlier a courtroom had shaken the nation, an unnoticed guest returned. Ariana Lowell walked into the Fulton County Administrative Court with her hair neatly tied, a plain white blouse, a slim folder in hand, and the familiar leather briefcase at her side. No one in the waiting room recognized her. Maybe a few staffers had seen the hearing on YouTube and thought she looked familiar, but no one said it. She didn't wait to be recognized. She hadn't come to be remembered. She'd come for something else. She walked directly to the complaints desk. The clerk was a young woman, maybe 22, probably new. Ariana smiled and gently placed the file on the desk. "I'd like to file a request to reopen 4 closed cases. None of them had legal representation." The clerk picked up the folder and skimmed a few pages. Her eyes paused slightly at the first name, Daniel King. She looked up, about to ask something, but Ariana gave a soft nod. "Yes, them, the ones I spoke about." "Oh," the girl said quietly, then nodded, slowly, as if she had just realized who stood before her. Ariana said nothing more. She turned to leave, but paused mid-hallway. It was the very hallway where she had once stood, fined $35,000 without being allowed a word. The same peeling paint, the dull aluminum sign, the yellowed overhead lights. But this time, it didn't feel heavy, not because it had changed, but because she wasn't afraid of it anymore. A security guard passed, nodding to her. She nodded back. No one knew that just 4 weeks earlier, this woman had made the entire system reckon with itself. And no one needed to know, because she hadn't done it to be remembered. She had done it so that others wouldn't be forgotten. Ariana stepped out just as the sun rose higher. Light filtered through the trees, landing gently on her shoulder, like a quiet acknowledgement from a city that had once turned its back and was now learning how to listen. No cameras, no press, no applause. But every step she took across the courthouse plaza echoed a final statement. "Justice isn't something I won for myself. Justice is what I leave behind, for those who never made it into the courtroom." 1 month later, in a small town near Flagstaff, Arizona, a woman in her 50s walked into a city council office with a worn file in hand. She was a hairdresser. No legal training, but she had printed the entire Lowell versus Fulton County hearing transcript. When the clerk asked what she was doing, she said, "I don't want to be the next person fined just because someone felt I was wrong." The clerk went quiet. No one had trained them for this. A wave of ordinary citizens from unseen places, bringing simple requests, evidence, procedure, fairness. In Portland, first-year law students were assigned to read the full transcript of Ariana's hearing as part of their legal ethics syllabus. The opening line of the course reader read, "Before you study the law, remember who it's for." And in Los Angeles, inside a small public high school library, a girl named Maria began typing the first line of her college essay. "Justice is not a privilege. It is a boundary that keeps power in check, and I want to stand on that line." Sometimes we think of justice as something distant, buried in thick books, behind marble walls, sealed by gavel strikes. But then one day someone walks into a room. No entourage, no media, no shouting, just a briefcase and a belief. Justice is not a privilege. It's a human right. Ariana Lowell didn't wait for someone to save her. She didn't wait for the system to wake up. She stood up, calmly, firmly, and without retreat. Not just to clear her name, but to restore the names of Daniel, Karen, James, people who lost everything in silence. And now, because of her, we're named, remembered, and honored. She didn't need applause, but every word she spoke struck at the pride of those who believed power didn't need to answer to anyone. And when she walked out of that courtroom, no headlines, no breaking news, she left behind something far greater than a ruling: hope. And if you felt a lump in your throat while hearing this story, you're not alone. If you've ever seen yourself in someone fined unfairly, ignored, dismissed because you weren't important enough to hear out, then this story was for you, because you deserve to be heard. You deserve to be answered with truth, not assumption. And if just one person like Ariana can shake a courtroom to its core, imagine what might happen when millions rise together. Share this story if you believe justice should be based on principle, not position. Let us know in the comments which moment from the hearing moved you most. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to follow more stories about ordinary people creating extraordinary change. Because maybe the next story will be yours. This isn't just a video, it's a reminder. When you refuse to stay silent, you are not alone. And when you speak, the world has no choice but to stop and listen.